Hey everybody, welcome to another Q&A session from the Reaper blog. I'm John Tidy. Today I'm doing a bunch of questions that came in through email. If you're not on the email list, then please check the show notes below or go to reaperblog.net/subscribe and sign up for that list. I have some exclusive things there, and it's also a great way to get in contact with me anytime you need. If you find these videos or anything else that I do on this channel helpful, consider being a patron. Help support what I'm doing here, helping you make better music, learning Reaper better, all that kind of stuff. It takes a lot of time and effort to do these videos, so if you have $2 you can donate every month, that'd be amazing. First question comes from Marcus. What's the best way to copy mixer settings from session to session? There are 2 or 3 different ways you can approach this problem. The first one that I do is to mix the song and then do a save as and remove all of the audio files from this folder. Then I import all the files for this song and then do automation to tweak things. Often there's different EQ and things like that that are needed as the instrumentation or the key changes, things like that. So there's always some tweaking that's involved, but that's one of the easiest ways that I found to do it. SWS snapshots can also work pretty well for this. Not perfectly, but it gets you a pretty good start. It saves you a lot of time in setting up a new project based on an old one. It doesn't give you your polarity inversion, and it doesn't give you any automation, but those are both things that you should probably be checking and doing custom for every song anyways. Snapshots tend to work better for different versions of the same song, and you can quickly audition things, go back to previous version of a single track. But there are some problems when you're importing tracks into a project where there's different track names and things like that. And another simple option is to just open up both projects in tabs, copy and paste settings or tracks between the 2 tabs. You can also consider mixing multiple songs in one project just so that consistency across the tracks is a little easier. You do have to do a lot more automation than you might do on one song, and the computer can get pretty bogged down with that kind of stuff. For a smaller project, that can work pretty well. I've done an entire album that way, and it gets pretty crazy, lots of crashes. You might think it's really simple, but it ends up being a lot more tracks once you start doing overdubs. Tracks need their own special effects chains and things like that. And you end up with 100 tracks, even if you want to keep it simple. And one final thought is that it's okay to treat each song as its own thing and kind of let mastering blend them all together. If it's you mixing the song, you're going to have your own take on things. It's going to have your sound, whether you're starting from scratch every time or not. Many big albums are mixed by multiple mixers, CLA, Michael Brower, and others, all in the same album from the same artist, and when you listen to it, it sounds cohesive. That's because of mastering. So treating each song as its own thing has its benefits as well, and is all going to make sense once you master it. Pat Autry writes in, as we age, our hearing naturally declines and we lose high frequency acuity. And when you combine that with the exposure of high volumes that come with performing live and listening to your favorite music, attending concerts, and enjoying loud music, diminished and sometimes extensive hearing loss is a hazard of the profession. What can you recommend to use to help visually determine what your ears can no longer perceive? In other words, what analysis software or plugins would work best to help verify if your mix is well balanced or too bright or strident? How could you use technology to overcome a hearing handicap? I have 2 thoughts on this. First is finding a way to test yourself, and then the second is how to compensate for this. In Reaper, we can use the JS Tone Generator plugin to create a tone, send that out of your speakers into the room at maybe 80 decibels for a 1K tone, and that's a tone that should be pretty audible whether you have hearing damage or not. Then you're going to go up the frequencies, maybe check 15K, 16K, 17K, 18K, all those frequencies, and just see where there's reduced sensitivity or complete loss. Once you know what frequencies you are lacking, you can then check reference mixes and see how they sound, where those frequencies are in decibel levels on a frequency spectrum analyzer. So find 15K on a mix that sounds good, that's professionally produced, and see where that is in the meter. And then compare your track. Does it sound good? Does it have enough of that level? It's not a perfect thing, but it can probably keep you going for a few more years. When I interned at a studio, there was this older engineer. In this story, he was actually doing some guitar recording and he was EQing on the console. And we knew that he was deaf, but he would turn around and he would look at the interns. And as he's cranking up the high shelf EQ, he'd wait for the interns to cringe when it was way too much. And then he'd back it off a little bit. And then he'd know that was the right amount. So just get an intern. Question from James Stafford. When mixing, do you have any particular strategies specific to virtual instruments and samples? I see a lot of mixing advice is focused on recorded music, and much of it seems to work well with my music, which is all virtual instruments and occasional samples. But my gut says there should be some mixing strategies particularly relevant to music made 100% in the box. When I think of 100% in the box productions, I think rigid MIDI, and I think dated sounds and just awful performances. And that's nonsense because there's so many artists producing music that's completely in the box, that sounds modern, that sounds amazing. It's important not to dismiss techniques and tutorials and information on mixing real instruments, whether it's acoustic guitars to orchestral to whatever. That can still apply to mixing your music in any genre. If you are writing songs with sample libraries, with sampled strings, you still need to know how to mix strings, and knowing how to mic that instrument can affect how you approach your mixing of it. So just understanding general knowledge of technology and recording techniques can really help with mixing. Even if you're just layering drum samples, you need to understand phase. Phase is definitely important with recorded instruments, but even with samples, you need to know what to listen for, how to fix it, and what happens if you don't. One trick I can give you is to use a track or a few tracks of imperfections, little clicks and crackles and found sounds, things that you can put into a musical grid at maybe 32 or 64th notes, in between beats, in between your main kick and snare and hi-hats, just to add some randomness, add some sort of human feel, even if it's totally sequenced, even if it's totally fake. Little clicks and things can make things sound more authentic. But your question was really more about mixing strategies, and I think using an analog style gain staging approach could really help. Minus 18 dBFS for each of your tracks coming into the mixer, and a lot of virtual instruments come out almost at clipping. So just turn down the master volume on each of those virtual instruments so you're at about minus 18 on the track meter, and it's a lot easier to mix. You can move the faders up or down. There's a lot of headroom for applying processing, and those analog style plugins tend to sound best around this level. Next question comes from Kurt Weber. Any info regarding proper rendering settings or rendering in general? I understand that, for example, I think MP3 rendering adds compression. So what rendering settings are proper and or more effective to get the best sounding files? When you're rendering, it's best to work in WAV format. All of the files that you're recording and any intermediate steps you want to keep in a WAV format because it's uncompressed. You're not losing any quality. So individual tracks that you're processing and bringing back in should be rendered as WAV. Your master mix should be rendered as a WAV. And depending on what you want to do with it, you'll also need an MP3. If you're emailing it to someone, give them an MP3 to listen to. MP3 is a lossy codec. It removes information to reduce the file size. That amount is determined by the bit rate. So a higher bit rate, like 320 kilobits per second, is a better sounding file, but it's a little bit bigger than is possible with MP3. MP3s could be variable bit rate or constant bit rate. Constant bit rate is a little more common because it's a more predictable amount of compression through the entire file. Variable bit rate changes the amount of compression based on the amount of content that's in that file at that moment. But variable bitrate files may be a little bit bigger. There's also the option of exporting FLAC files, which are lossless compressed files. You can take a wave, turn it into FLAC, and turn it back into WAV without losing anything. It's not possible with MP3 because that information is discarded. MP3 is the smallest file size, WAV is the largest, and FLAC is in between. Mikhail asks, how do you approach drum editing in Reaper? Do you slice up or time stretch? How do you do beat gridding in Reaper? Drum editing isn't something that I've talked about very much in the Reaper blog because I have a drum editing service called BeatFix, and there'll be a link in the description. I've offered that service since about 2007, and I started off with doing Beat Detective in Pro Tools and then switched to a slip editing technique in Reaper. And over the years, that technique has evolved, and I think it's unique. I don't think anyone else is doing it exactly the same way, and I've never shared that information with anyone. That's kind of a trade secret. It's part of my business, so I think it's okay if I don't share that information. But basically, I'm doing a slip editing technique. I have snap to grid turned off. I choose where I want to cut. I split. I auto crossfade. I move the item onto the grid based on the constant zoom setting that I choose, and I avoid stretching as much as possible. I really don't like the sound of stretch markers on drums or any real time stretching unless it's, sometimes you can get away with it, but generally I don't like the sound of it. I split where I want it, and I stretch very rarely, only in extreme cases where a clean edit can't be made. Kenny actually put up a few videos on drum editing. He is not using the same techniques that I am, but the information is out there if you don't know anything about this at all. And that's all the questions for this week. Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Here's a list of the supporters on Patreon this month. If you can contribute $2, $5, anything, patreon.com/thereeperblog, and really help me out. And also, please visit reaperblog.net for a lot more tutorials.